Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight, or today. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to today's event with Robert Darnton, discussing his latest book, Pirating and Publishing, The Book Trade in the Age of Enlightenment, in conversation with Adam Colman. Today's event is part of Harvard Bookstore's Friday Forum series, which takes place on Friday afternoons during the academic year as a way to highlight scholarly books in a wide range of fields. Though we remain digital for the time being, we have a full schedule of virtual events in the coming weeks as part of this afternoon series and others. So do check out our website for our complete event calendar. For today's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat function of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of Pirating and Publishing. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. And lastly, as you may know, if you've participated in large virtual gatherings lately, which I assume you have, technical issues may come up. We do apologize in advance for that. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Robert Darnton is the Carl H. Pforzheimer University Professor and University Librarian Emeritus of Harvard University. He is the author of several books, including The Great Cat Massacre and Other Episodes in French Cultural History, the forbidden bestsellers of pre-revolutionary France, and The Case for Books, Past, Present, and Future. For his writing and devotion to the world of books, he is a recipient of a National Book Critics Circle Award, MacArthur Prize Fellowship, a French Legion of Honor, the National Humanities Medal, and numerous other honors. Today, he is joined in conversation by Adam Colman, a writer, editor, and producer for WBUR's beloved Open Source with Christopher Lydon. He is the author of the books New Uses for Failure, Ben Lerner's 1004, and Drugs and the Addiction Aesthetic in 19th Century Literature. His essays and scholarship have been featured in venues such as The Believer, The Nervous Breakdown, and the Pittsburgh City Paper. And he has also written for and been featured in 2 episodes of KCRW's podcast, The Organist, including one of my personal favorites, episode 67, The Scientific Method of the Ramones. Today, they will be discussing Robert's latest book, Pirating and Publishing, a rich and sweeping social geography of the Fertile Crescent, the countries bordering France stretching from Holland to Switzerland, where works of France's most infamous and often banned luminaries were printed, shared, and even sold back to their native home, where stricter laws limited most aspects of commerce, except for piracy. Offering a rare glimpse into one of these publishing pirates, Darnton crafts an exquisite portrait of an early industry laced with cutthroat intrigue, populated by idealists and opportunists, and committed to spreading the gospels of the Enlightenment to a nation on the verge of revolution. It's a grand understatement to say that we are having this event in the midst of a challenging and unfamiliar time for the book trade, when the future is, at best, misty. But we are fortunate to have people like Robert here to remind us of our fledgling beginnings when uncertainty and the will to know spurred us to create better. Without further ado, I am now delighted to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Robert and Adam.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. I love the Harvard Bookstore. It's a great place. I wish we could all be there in person. But we can't. So I'm going to try to give you some idea of what I'm attempting to do in this book. It is an effort to understand the book as a force in history, not in some general way, but during a critical period, which is that of the Enlightenment, culminating in the French Revolution. So it's an exciting time. But what hasn't been properly understood, I believe, is the way books shaped things and how they mattered, how they got to readers, how they were produced and distributed and read, the importance of books in general. In fact, to my surprise, because I spent now a long time in the archives of the only publisher from that 18th century that have survived, what surprised me was the fact that piracy was so important. In fact, it was responsible for more than half the books that actually circulated on the marketplace in France during the second half of the 18th century. One contemporary estimate said there were 30 million pirated books just floating around on the market, being bought and sold and read. Pirating was the heart of the publishing industry in the Age of Enlightenment. So it's important to understand what piracy was, how it operated, why it mattered. I think it mattered tremendously because it was in what I call the Fertile Crescent that most French books were actually produced. Now, this Fertile Crescent surrounded France outside the French borders to the north and to the east, stretching from Amsterdam to Brussels, through the Rhineland and into Switzerland. There were dozens and dozens of, of publishing houses that essentially worked as pirates. That is, as soon as any book that had any promise of selling appeared in France, it was immediately set in print in Brussels or Geneva and could reach the French market almost as rapidly as the original. Now, these pirated books were relatively inexpensive. Paper was much cheaper outside of France. Labor was cheaper. The pirates, of course, didn't have to pay anything for the manuscript. And above all, they envisaged a public that was, so to speak, down market. They weren't trying to sell to the elite in Paris, but rather to ordinary people scattered throughout the kingdom and, of course, throughout all of Europe, because at this time, French is the language spoken or read by all educated people. So these pirates are opening up a new market. The old market was dominated by the book publishers, sellers, printers in Paris. They belonged to a guild, and the guild had an official monopoly on the production of books. In fact, it was a monopoly backed by the state. They even had the power to police the book trade to make sure that there were no pirate editions competing with them. And they had had actually a trade war with the provincial publishers in the 17th century. The result of this trade war was the utter domination of Paris over the provinces. So provincial publishing, which had been very powerful and important in places like Lyon and Rouen from the 16th and 17th century, pretty well died out, and the provincials were reduced to sort of retailers for these great monopolists in Paris. But the Parisians are producing elegant books on fine paper. They paid for the original manuscripts, usually badly, but they dominated this small market with goods that are sort of like snuff boxes, if you want, whereas the pirates are producing books on cheap paper at a much lower price. Now, in itself, you might say, well, so what? This kind of thing happens. But my point is that most books are produced outside the law, outside the French law. And that meant that anything went. There was a kind of Wild West character to publishing in this Fertile Crescent at this time. Now, the publishers themselves were often respectable businessmen at home in Geneva or Neuchâtel or Brussels or Amsterdam. They were, many of them, pillars of society. They went around in carriages, they owned vineyards, they lived in fine houses, they got elected to municipal office. But in France, they were called and buccaneers and pirates, they were the wild element because, of course, there were no rules to the game. In fact, if you think about the general nature of publishing 200 to 300 years ago, it was radically different from what exists today. For starters, there was no freedom of the press. True, censorship had ended in Britain, but not on the continent, where there was censorship everywhere. There also there was no copyright. On the continent, unlike Britain, which from 1710 on had a copyright law, the Statute of Anne, but on the continent, books had privileges. And the concept of a privilege is very different from the concept of copyright. In fact, there's a whole debate in the 18th century in England, but also on the continent, about intellectual property, which is one of the subjects I discuss. So no freedom of the press, no copyright, but also no royalties. Authors, as I mentioned, sometimes got some money for selling a manuscript, usually very little or none at all. And so you had no authors in France, virtually no authors living from their pen. One contemporary said there were 7 authors who could make a living by writing. They all lived by patronage and pensions and wheeling and dealing in different ways. There were no returns. So for booksellers, if you didn't sell a book you'd ordered, you couldn't send it back to a publisher as you can today. And that made bookselling fundamentally different. There was also no limited liability. A lot of people are going bankrupt. If you went bankrupt, you went to prison, debtor's prison. And in a way, you could say there was no money. That is to say, no guaranteed bills backed by the state that circulated as legal currency. So the conditions were very, very difficult, but the potential for striking it rich was tremendous. And in fact, you certainly would argue, I would argue, that virtually the entire Enlightenment is produced outside France. These publishing houses flourished. Anyone who wrote a book that challenged any of the church, the state, morality, any of the accepted values within France would not send his or her book to censors. They would send it to Geneva or to Amsterdam to get published, and then it would be smuggled into France. France had an elaborate network of booksellers who dealt with these illegal books. Why? Well, they wanted to make money, and the provincial booksellers who had been wiped out by the Parisians as publishers were now allies of the pirates operating outside the border. Alliance between the network of booksellers everywhere in the French provinces with the original publishers really brought the entire Enlightenment to France, but it brought a lot more in addition. Bestsellers of all kinds, ordinary books, and then a category that was called by the professionals, booksellers and publishers, livres philosophiques, philosophical books. They had special catalogs for philosophical books, livres philosophiques, you would see on the title. And when you look at the ones actually offered under this category, they did include some real philosophy, especially radical Enlightenment atheism of D'Holbach and Helvétius and people like that. Not so much Voltaire, who was relatively moderate compared with these others, but along with the philosophy, there was pornography and libel, attacking government ministers, etc. They were all mixed up in the same category of philosophical books. They were especially dangerous, so they were treated in a special way. When crates were shipped out, they were hidden in the straw that protected them, or they were sometimes slipped between the sheets of legal or pirated versions of legal books. And so there was a real, you could call a seditious element in the book trade. So you've got at least three things going on at the same time. One, an enlargement of the reading public, what I would call democratization of access to culture. Two, the breakthrough of the Enlightenment, which is now spreading in print on a very large scale. And three, seditious books, irreligious books, immoral books, books the French loved. They were very naughty. One example is a book called Thérèse Philosophe, Teresa the Philosopher. It's, to our reading today, it would qualify as hardcore pornography, but when the lovers need to replenish their energy, their pillow talk is all about philosophy, and much of it is actually lifted from philosophical treatises. So in the 18th century, you've got this mixture of all kinds of elements that are reaching a new kind of public, and I think producing the material out of which not just the Enlightenment, but a lot of revolutionary ideas are going to develop. Now, I don't want to go on and on. I want to leave room for Adam to put questions, but I would like to make one or two points, if I could, Adam, first, about the way these people behave, because the archives are so rich. I've read 50,000 letters written by people who had anything to do with books, authors, wagon drivers, workers who pulled the bar of the press, especially booksellers and publishers. Fortunately, these archives are so rich, you could get inside their way of thinking and to follow their operations in a lot of detail, and that is fun. So yes, this is a book about books, but I hope it's not bookish in the sense of being stale and academic, because this was a Balzacian world in which people are trying to trick each other, they're duping each other, there are all sorts of plots and counterplots, fake everything. For example, fake books, because constantly the pirates are putting new title pages on old books that weren't selling so well and trying to sell them all over again. Or fake announcements of books, fake advertising, if you like, notices put in newspapers or prospectuses, flogged by circular letters, by traveling salesmen, in which a publisher announces a book that he doesn't really mean to publish, but he wants to test the pulse of the public. If there's enough demand, as relayed by booksellers, he decides to publish it. But he could also publish an announcement in order to dissuade another publisher, pirate, from publishing it, because he might be busy printing a book and he wants to scare off the other pirates by announcing that he's going to produce a book. Or you could use an announcement for blackmail. That is, you might know that if I'm in Geneva, that a publisher in Lausanne is doing a certain book, and I can announce I'm going to publish an edition too, in order to frighten him, and then he might make terms. That is to say, he might agree to sell me a large number of copies at a steep discount. So things like this are going on all the time. In fact, there are even fake companies. I found one case where a wonderful order arrived at the publishers for all kinds of books, an order worth a lot of money. So the publisher is tempted to send the shipment off. It came from Toulouse by a company called Bergès et Compagnie. And it used the exact phrasing that is typical of business letters at this time. It sounded very professional. So the publisher was tempted, but thought, I've never heard of this company. I better write some friends in Toulouse and find out. Well, the friends replied, and it turned out that the person who had made this wonderful order was actually a clerk in a bookstore who invented the name Bergès et Compagnie because he wanted to get a large shipment of books that he would simply sell on for his own and not pay for. Things like that are going on all the time. And that's why, as I said, it's a kind of Wild West world, because the main impediment to piracy was not so much the book police in France, although they were highly organized and very interesting. The main difficulty was the other pirates, because everyone is rushing to the market at the same time. So conditions are completely different from today. Today, a bestseller or a huge seller, a so-called blockbuster, which actually subsidizes the rest of a publisher's list, that blockbuster bestseller is produced in enormous numbers by a single publisher. Not so in the 18th century. A really important bestseller is produced simultaneously by a dozen or so pirates who are all rushing to the market. And the danger is that you would get there too late. So they are competing against each other. It's a highly risky business. And in taking there are huge profits that you can make, but there are huge dangers at the same time. And so a lot of the book I've written is how they perceived the markets, understood the dangers, dealt with one another. They made non-aggression pacts, confederations to market pirated books together among the pirates. And they betrayed each other and pulled dirty tricks of all kinds, which we could talk about a little bit more if you like, Adam. But in general, this is not just something that's colorful, it's something that's important. This is the way most books reached readers. And I think we didn't really know anything about it. Now it's possible to reconstruct this world of books in lots of detail and to help bring this world back to life. So that's basically what the book is all about.
It's a fascinating book. It opens up so much, and I think that the colorful stuff is the important stuff, which is partly why this book fascinates me so much. The piracy, the balsation, shenanigans, those things change history. The sort of lurid, thrilling stuff is a kind of reframing or contributes something to how we think of this period in a major way. And I'm curious to get started. Like, what is the standard picture of the Enlightenment, the public sphere, the coffee house sharing of ideas that we've sort of gotten used to, and how does this idea of piracy change that standard idea we have of the 18th century Age of Reason, the Enlightenment?
Well, it depends which version, of course, the standard idea you accept. I mean, one version is that it was an elite phenomenon. This version concentrates largely on Voltaire. Voltaire had a strategy for advancing enlightenment. I mean, he was committed to the cause, but he believed in a highly stratified society. And what you tried to do was to take over the elite, to change their way of thinking, and then to let the ideas trickle down. So a common view of the Enlightenment is a sort of trickling down view, and the problem has been how far down. Another view is the Enlightenment had different varieties or nuances of extremism. So you got the radical Enlightenment, the moderate Enlightenment, you got the Protestant Enlightenment, even the Catholic Enlightenment. Now, in my view is, of course, the great famous philosophe, Voltaire and Rousseau and Montesquieu and Diderot, they were all terribly important, but they became so to speak, celebrities. And they got marketed. In fact, I have the diary of a traveling salesman, and he talks about Voltaire and Rousseau in this way, because what's happening is the Enlightenment is reaching a new kind of public, as I said before. So I actually see the Enlightenment as not just a collection of ideas, but as a movement to change the way people thought. In fact, if you read most of Voltaire and Montesquieu even, most of their ideas already existed in the 17th century. What they're doing is they're putting new energy into them, and there's a sense of commitment to a cause. I find this especially moving in the case of Voltaire as an old man, because he's angry at the injustice of society and particular cases of miscarried justice infuriate him. The most famous is the death of Calas, a Protestant in Toulouse, who was tortured and murdered juridically by the parliament because they thought he had killed his own son to prevent his son from being converted to Catholicism. Well, I'm rambling on, and maybe I should make it briefer, but what I'm trying to say is that the Enlightenment as a movement is something attached deeply to the diffusion of books. The driving force on the part of the philosophers, is, if you like, idealistic, but the driving force of the people who made it happen by getting the books to the readers is largely economic. They're trying to make money. And I worked very hard to see, are these publishers actually activists committed to the cause, or are they businessmen? On the whole, this is controversial, but on the whole, I think they were businessmen. So that's my take on the Enlightenment. It's a matter of diffusion as well as of injecting new ideas into the public.
And so the connection between the sort of Enlightenment marketplace of ideas, this diffusion of ideas, knowledge, argument, discussion, and the marketplace, that the connection between the marketplace of ideas and the marketplace is just about a shared energy, a kind of piratical ambition that is on the side of both the philosophers and the people out to make money. I'm interested in hearing more about the connection between the money people and the writers.
Well, the publishers knew the writers. The case of Voltaire and Rousseau are the most obvious. We have correspondence between these great writers and their publishers. Marc Michel Rey in Amsterdam published most of Rousseau's works. They got on well. Actually, Rousseau became the godfather of Rey's child, and he was decently paid by Rey. So it's an amicable relationship. The same is true of Voltaire and his main publisher, Gabriel Cramer in Geneva. As you probably know, Voltaire had to leave France. He lived right on the border between France and Geneva. And he published in the last stages of his life, everything practically through this man called Cramer, who was a major publisher, a very dignified person, linked up with the aristocracy of Geneva. But what I find fascinating is that at the same time, Voltaire is actually cooperating with the pirates. He sends proofs of his books to other publishers for cheap editions. Now, why does he do this? Not to make money. Voltaire was a wealthy man by 1770, by earlier than that, 1760, and his concern was to spread the Enlightenment. And that's why I mentioned Voltaire as an angry old man with his famous motto, écraser l'infâme, crush the infamous thing. That is, crush superstition and intolerance. We have to rid the world of injustice, and we can do it through books. So Voltaire is committed in a very big way. But the booksellers, I've looked and looked for ideological commitment on the part of booksellers. And believe me, it's not there. Having read maybe 25,000 letters of booksellers from the 18th century, I can assure you that that is not what they're trying to do. They often say things like, the best book for a bookseller is a book that sells. Or, I sell books that I would never read myself, but I want to satisfy my customers. And in fact, the booksellers were eager for Voltaire to die. I found several references in letters in which they say, when is he going to die, this old man? Because he kept issuing new editions of his complete works by touching them up here and there. And that made the potential customers furious, because who would want to pay good money to buy a new edition of the works of Voltaire that were virtually the same, except for a few passages here and there. So the booksellers were very annoyed at this ploy by Voltaire, who's just trying to spread enlightenment. And several of their letters say, when is he going to die? We want a definitive editions of his works. So it's a complicated, fascinating process in which they know of the writers. Many of them know the writers. I've seen reports of people who have gone to Ferney and visited Voltaire, described him sitting in bed and writing little treatises. They were inside the operation of the Enlightenment, but they were making it happen by trying to make money.
And the things they were selling, well, you said it didn't have to be lofty, sublime literature. This is an age in which the novel as a form starts to emerge in the 18th century. I'm curious about, so we've heard the philosophical side. What about the sort of literary imaginative side of literary history and piracy? How does that engage this scheme?
Well, on the literary side, there's no question that Rousseau's La Nouvelle Héloïse, a long epistolary novel, was a fabulous bestseller. It swept people off its feet. In fact, it was something new because it moved people. So I see, maybe as a student of Romanticism, you've seen the same phenomenon, a new kind of emotional connection between writers and readers. It seems to me that it begins with Pamela, if you like, in England, and it moves to France with a Nouvelle Héloïse, and to Germany with the Sorrows of young Werther. But that's new and different. Most of the literature before this wave of sentiment overwhelms readers in the Rousseauistic vein is quite different and is not known to most people today. So I've done statistics, and I have a list of 1,000, I think it's 556 titles, and I can rank them, I think, with pretty good accuracy as to what was most in demand. Well, what you find is the bestsellers are by writers such as Madame Riccoboni. Well, I doubt that anyone, very, very few people today have ever heard of Madame Riccoboni, but the French readers loved her. She wrote, again, epistolary novels. They were full of sentiment, but it wasn't the Rousseauistic kind. Baculard d'Arnaud is another best-selling novelist, and he's dropped out of French history. In fact, most of the best-selling writers don't exist at all in most standard versions of French history, because that's what happens. We read a canon of classics that we take to be the history of literature, but the literature actually read, the lived literature of the past has been mainly forgotten. And that's particularly true of the novels. So I think if you want to get the flavor of literature as experienced by people in the 18th century, read Madame Riccoboni, the letters of Fanny Spingler. It's pretty sappy, a lot of it, but it gives you the flavor of the past.
And what gets lost, I guess, as we either winnow out certain canonical or save certain canonical novels from a period, or basically, actually, even maybe more specifically, as we moved historically away from this era of piracy and 18th century philosophizing and into an era of intellectual property, of professionalized authors who are making more money. What's gained and what changes as that shift happens?
Well, the shift, in my view, takes place rather late in France. I think earlier in England. In Germany, it was uneven because there was Western Protestant Germany, highly literate, full of reading clubs and reading societies and so on. But then Germany, east of the Elbe River, is a world without books. There's a German study called Volk ohne Buch, people without books. But so it's uneven, is what I'm trying to say. In my view, though, the big change, which you can see clearly in the case of France, comes in the middle of the 19th century, and a lot of its causes are technological. Maybe the most important thing was cheap paper, because before the 19th century, each sheet of paper is made by hand, and it's a very laborious process. Of course, it's left us with 18th century books that you can feel the handmade quality of the paper, hold it up to the light and look at the chain lines and so on. It gives a reader today, I think, a sense of contact with the past that you wouldn't have. But cheap paper made of wood pulp by steam-powered machines transforms things, and you get steam-powered presses as well. You get railroads, so the distribution system is far more effective. And then you've got not only an increase in population, but an increase in literacy. So by 1850, more or less, you've got a mass reading public. Now that's a transformation, because I'm talking about the beginning of a mass public, thanks to piracy, but you're not there for another 50 years or more. And so that to me is the crucial thing. And of course, you've got novels being printed in periodicals as sequences. Dickens writes consciously for that, and so do a lot of French writers like Eugène Sue. And therefore, the periodical press is working with the classic book publishing press to make the most of this mass market. So that's a different world. And it's the world that Balzac began to describe in what I think is his greatest book, The Illusions Perdues, Lost Illusions, in which he describes the publishing industry, the publishers, the writers, the booksellers, in wonderful detail. I find that same world, but under different circumstances, existing in the late 18th century. So I'm trying to give a Balzacian study before Balzac, so to speak.
The other thing about Balzac, well, he sort of points backwards and forward in this kind of all-encompassing epic, fiction about an entire world, speaks to our own sort of all-encompassing narrative about our world that exists sort of online. I can't help, especially when we're talking about piracy, intellectual property, but think about the internet analogies. And I'm wondering what lessons we can draw from the 18th century and 18th century piracy for today, for the kind of piracy we see now digitally. Does it produce a similar kind of intellectual ferment? Is there a similar energy that has existed in internet piracy that was around in the 18th century? What are the connections between those two?
Well, it's a wonderful question, Adam, but I don't have a facile answer. I'm always skeptical about learning lessons from the past because that decontextualizes things and it builds anachronism into the study of history. But that doesn't mean we can't gain fresh perspective on things. In an earlier book, I tried to study oral communication in Paris, thanks to a police investigation, which I reconstructed. It's a sort of detective story, but it showed that talk multiplied the effect of print, and that it was possible actually to follow talk and even singing of poetry in the 18th century, so that you did get a mixture of media. A lot of books are read aloud. There are poems being improvised every day to familiar tunes because everyone carries a repertoire of melodies in their head, the way we all know the tune to a happy birthday or something like that. And so people are improvising new words to old tunes. They're passing around scraps of paper about gossip. The scraps are collected and printed as books. And so you've got an interpenetration of different media, even in the 18th century. But today, of course, it happens on a spectacular scale. And it happens, I think, often with very unfortunate results because we have what some people call a silo mentality. That is, within the social networks, people only communicate with people who think the same way. In the 18th century, I think that these closed circuits weren't closed at all, that they open up and the dissemination was broader. But another point of comparison might be in politics, the importance of what, for lack of a better word, you could call celebrities, famous people. The diamond necklace affair makes Cagliostro and the Cardinal of Rouen, they're known by everyone. Beaumarchais is a very public figure involved in all kinds of political affairs. The Comte de Mirabeau, who will become a leader of the revolution, is famous before the revolution for his extravagant private life and his hard-hitting pamphlets. Well, today, I think the public often is energized by outsized personalities. I won't mention them all by name, but you can think of several of them. So, you know, among journalists, there is this phrase, names make news. That was happening in the 18th century. And I think a lot of people understood the world by following and being fascinated by famous writers, such as Mirabeau. He wrote a book about his experience being imprisoned in the prison of Vincennes. And another writer, Linguet, wrote his memoirs of the Bastille. These were two bestsellers about arbitrary imprisonment by lettre de cachet. The king signs a letter, there's no judicial process, you disappear into prison. And this is part of the mythology that is built up about an autocratic, despotic monarchy. The monarchy wasn't really despotic at all, but this myth, through best-selling books, took. Well, we've got lots of myths going today, a lot of false information. And therefore, I'm fascinated by the false information that's being spread in the 18th century. So that, yes, you know, there are parallels, not direct connections, but I think the attempt to understand whole systems of communication and not just look at the printed book or the printed word, but to try to see the way they interact is crucial.
I don't know, it's amazing what this photofocal point on piracy can open up. It explains the world back then, and it does suggest ways into thinking about and understanding our world now. I see we have a lot of questions, and it seems like a good time to throw things over to the Q&A. So Benjamin can take it away from here.
I would be happy to. So yes, we have quite a few questions. We'll get through as many as our remaining time allows. I'm going to start with this question from an attendee who's wondering, so on the topic of banned books, were there laws prohibiting the ownership of this type of literature at the time, or just the printing and sale of this literature?
Well, it's a good question. And at one point, the Pope actually said that anyone who owned the Encyclopédie should turn it in, and it was sinful even to own it. There was talk about going into private libraries and trying to seize illegal books. I haven't found a single case in which that has happened. So I do not believe that owning a condemned book, a dangerous book, was in itself dangerous. The police work is at the level of booksellers and book smugglers. And the police were very intelligent, also authors, I should add. I found 500 reports on writers written between 1748 and 1752. And they systematically did a census of all the writers. They were very intelligent, this literary police of the 18th century. In fact, in one of the reports, the policeman says, this author, he can write prose, but he can't manage Alexandrian verse. So a cop is talking about the literary qualities of the books he's policing. But never have I found an example of a threat to individuals for owning prohibited books, even though the church declared it was sinful.
Perfect, thank you. So we've gotten a couple questions that sort of ask about demand. So I'll sort of ask this question from Mark in the audience. If the motives of many of the Enlightenment actors were economic, that begs the question of what created the demand for these controversial books. So what was sort of inspiring people to seek them out, or what was the market for it?
It's a very good question, and I don't think I have an adequate answer. I mean, what creates demand? Well, my guess, I'm now guessing, but I think it's a lot of things. For example, there's a tremendous interest in travel books, but these are books about Cook and Bougainville going around the world and seeing strange new peoples that no one has ever heard of. So there is an exoticism that fascinated people. Books about Russia, Eastern Russia also did. Books about America were big sellers. So I think one element is curiosity about the rest of the world. And these travel books in the 18th century were tremendously important and communicated a lot of knowledge, not just geography, but history and even philosophy. History books themselves are very important. People are curious about the past. Historians are very popular, but they're not the historians we've heard of. Well, I could give you examples like Velly's Histoire de France. I don't think anyone reads it anymore, but the French were interested in history. Science books, because, you know, the chemical revolution is just beginning after Priestley and then Lavoisier in France. They didn't read books by Lavoisier. There was a chemist called Macquer whose works were very popular. People were curious about what they called natural history, what we would call botany today. So I sense an opening up of curiosity about the surrounding world, about the past, about other parts, not just the natural world, but the geographical world. And then the novel. I mean, the novel is everywhere at this time. And as I said, you've got these famous writers, often connected with scandal. Voltaire is terrific at spreading scandal. In fact, one of his best works is a kind of mockery of Joan of Arc, who's revered by the French. Well, he's making her look rather dubious as a heroine, and it's funny. So the attraction of humor and ridicule is enormous, as well as that of sentiment. So I see a lot of things going into demand, but how and when it originates, I have a general idea, but I don't want to imply that I've got it totally understood. I think we need more research in that area.
Great, well, thank you. So we have a multifaceted question that I'm also sort of curious about from an attendee named Walter, who, in a sort of a clarifying question. So when we talk about sort of literacy at this time period, we're talking about book ownership as something that's still mainly an elite practice. People with sort of wealth and status are owning books, or was it also becoming something that was common among people of all classes at this time?
Well, again, it's a very good question. There have been lots of really important studies of literacy and even of the owning of books. A friend of mine, a French historian called Daniel Roche, has studied thousands of inventories made of people's possessions after they died and looked for the number of books. He's found that books are quite widespread, even among servants and working people. Working people, laborers, not day laborers, but skilled artisans, yes. So I don't think at all that the book is confined to an elite. In fact, that's one of the messages I'm trying to get across. As I said, the book is now penetrating into the everyday world of ordinary people. Ordinary meaning, well, the middle classes in the larger sense of the word, and a lot of the laboring classes, artisans, shopkeepers, read books. And there are book clubs. You pay a certain amount of money, not usually a great deal, and you can belong to a club, go there and read its stock of books or borrow the books from lending libraries. Literacy is actually getting to be fairly widespread. I used to think that it was very, very limited, and we're just talking about an elite when we discuss the Enlightenment. I don't think so anymore, but it's largely urban, and it's much more male than female. But in cities, the majority of men can read and do read. I mean, you read street signs and there are posters all over the place. The printed word is omnipresent. So I think we're dealing with, as I say, not yet the mass public of the 19th century, but a very broad public. And this is crucial to, I think, understand the nature of the Enlightenment and the possibility of the revolution.
Amazing. So we have about time for 2 more questions, I think. So I'm going to transition to this really great question from Chris Keneally in the audience, who asks about the idea of droit d'auteur with like the Anglo-Saxon copyright and French privileges, and sort of thinking about it in conjunction with the issue of modern copyright. So what exactly did copyright look like in the idea of the French culture?
Well, maybe I should begin by saying something shocking. I think the copyright laws we live under now are terrible and should be changed. They won't be because of the power of lobbies in Washington. But copyright now covers the life of the author plus 70 years. And that means most books are covered by copyright for more than a century. Most books published in the US after 1723 are not in the public domain. So most 20th century literature is out of reach for just a constant reprinting. Copyright, I think, is abused. That's the present. In the 18th century, of course, you got the copyright statute of Queen Anne in 1710 in England. But it caused tremendous disputes, and you can follow a series of lawsuits throughout the 18th century up to 1774, when in a famous case, copyright is limited to 14 years renewable. So the idea of permanent copyright is rejected, but it took time in England. It's discussed in France. As I said, the concept of privilege, which comes from the Latin meaning private law, is very different from copyright. It meant that by a private law, a certain bookseller could have the exclusive monopoly to sell a certain book, and others couldn't do it. Sounds like copyright, but if you actually, I've done a study of the censorship, and the censors never talk about violations of religion and morality in the state. They talk about quality, because a privilege is a royal stamp of approval. Now, some writers like Diderot are beginning to develop a concept of intellectual property, but it doesn't take in the laws. There is a book code published in 1777 that explicitly rejects that idea and says all books, legal books, exist by the grace of the king. Now that's very different from copyright. So it's going to take to 1794 and the French Revolution to create copyright on the continent. The lack of copyright is part of this world in which the pirates are just running free because, of course, there is no international effect of privilege. A privilege only holds within France if it's given by the French king. So we've got piracy in Germany. Vienna is a great source of pirated books in the German-speaking world against Frankfurt and Berlin. In the English-speaking world, it's especially Ireland and Scotland that are pirating books that originally were printed in London. So everywhere you've got books entering the market from the margins and copyright being very ineffective.
Thank you. So this will be our last question, and it's been asked by a couple different people, but there's a general interest in the idea of tchotchkes, and it was followed later on by Byroniana, the idea of creating side supplemental materials for books. But so David McClellan wants to know, did booksellers in your Fertile Crescent become involved in a side trade of tchotchkes related to books and popular authors, which was seen later with Byroniana?
I must say I've not noticed that. I think booksellers get drawn into, so to speak, side trades, but they tend to be lending clubs. They organize reading groups or reading societies so they can convert their stock of books into a library, which people will pay to use. I have not seen booksellers involved in side speculations. Publishers do, that is to say, they speculate on pamphlets often. And a pamphlet is a very different thing from a book. But no, I would say that on the whole, people dealing with the printed word do not move into other areas with side speculations.
Great. Well, we do unfortunately have to wrap up there. We do have quite a few questions. Thank you everyone for submitting them and for being interested in this conversation. It has been fantastic. So thank you once again, Robert and Adam, for joining us today. Thanks to everyone out there for spending part of your afternoon with us. And please learn more about this incredible book and purchase Pirating and Publishing at harvard.com. I've put links to purchase in the chat a couple times. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy your weekend, everyone. Keep reading and stay safe. All right. Bye, Robert and Adam.
Bye. Thank you.